Now columns of men covered the roads all around the town where the distribution of parcels was taking place. 2 parcels to a man, Deans had announced. The effect on the morale of the men, Flight Sergeant Calton Younger remembered, was electric. The arrival of the parcels was a plain miracle, and we promptly invested Deans with the qualities of a saint. Deans cycled from column to column on his frail bicycle with the distorted tyre, seeing that every man got his quota, and warning the half-starved POWs, who had been subsisting for the most part on raw vegetables, not to eat too much, but to save as much as you can, because we don't know what Jerry still has up his sleeve for us. Nevertheless, most men, Deans saw, were eating as though it was their last meal. Flight Sergeant Geoffrey Wilson wolfed his way through the parcel: corned beef, biscuits, chocolate, and above all 120 cigarettes. He was eating like mad and smoking like mad, because I intended to die full and not hungry. The British planes found them as they sat there eating, 9 RAF Typhoon fighters. They circled overhead, and then, in what Wilson was to remember as a kind of a dreamlike, fascinating way, they peeled off and dived. Someone said, "My God, they're coming for us!" Men scattered wildly in all directions. Some tried to put out coloured identifying cloth strips which they were carrying for just such an emergency. Others threw themselves into ditches, lay behind walls, ran for cover in barns, or took shelter in the town itself. But many were too late. One after another the Typhoons swooped in, firing rockets and dropping anti-personnel bombs among the columns. Men yelled, "We're your mates! We're your mates!" 8 planes made individual attacks. The 9th, perhaps realizing the mistake, pulled up. It was all over in minutes. 60 POWs were dead. A score of others were injured, and some would die of their wounds in German hospitals. Deans was sick with despair as he walked along the roads and saw the carnage. He immediately ordered identification of the dead. Some bodies were riddled almost beyond recognition. Just bits and pieces that had to be shoveled into the graves, Deans was later to recall. After the dead had been buried and the wounded moved into German hospitals, a cold and determined Deans cycled over to Colonel Ostman at his temporary headquarters. There was no military courtesy this time from Deans. "Ostman," he said, "I want you to write me out a pass that will carry me through to the British lines. This sort of thing must never happen again." Ostman looked at Deans in amazement. "Mr. Deans," he said, "I couldn't do that." Deans stared back at him. "We don't know who is going to overrun our group," he warned. "It could be the British, or it could be the Russians. We don't give a damn who liberates us. But which do you want to surrender to?" Deans looked squarely at the German. "Somehow I don't think you'll have much of a future with the Russians." He paused to let his last statement sink in. Then he said quietly, "Colonel, write out the pass." Ostman sat down at a table and on Wehrmacht paper wrote out a note which would carry Deans through enemy territory. "I don't know how you'll get through the front lines," he told Deans, "but at least this will get you up to them." Deans said, "I would like to take the guard Charlie Gumbach with me." Ostman thought about that for a moment and said, "Agreed." He wrote out a pass for Gumbach. "And I could do with a bicycle that isn't falling apart," said Dixie. Ostman looked at him and then, shrugging, said that he would arrange that too. As he left the office, Deans had one final remark. "I will be back with Charlie to bring my men out. I promise you that." Then, with a crisp salute, Deans said, "Thank you, Colonel." The Colonel saluted too. "Thank you, Mr. Deans," he said. That night, accompanied by German Corporal Charlie Gumbach, the indomitable Dixie Deans set out for the long ride to the British lines. By nightfall, Koniev, watching the map anxiously as Zhukov's tanks streaked toward Berlin, was urging his men on to even greater speed. "Don't worry about your flanks, Pavel Semenovich," he told General Rybalko, commander of the Third Guards tank army. "Don't worry about being detached from the infantry. Keep going." Years afterward, Koniev remarked, "At that moment I knew what my tank commanders must be thinking. Here you are throwing us into this manhole, forcing us to move without strength on our flanks. Won't the Germans cut our communications, hit us from the rear? The tall Koniev, clapping his marshal's epaulettes with his hands, told the tank commanders, "I will be present. You need not worry. My observation post will be travelling with you in the very middle of the drive." Rybalko and General D.D. Lelyushenko, commander of the 4th Guards Tank Army, responded brilliantly. In a dash resembling that of the US 2nd and 5th Armoured Divisions to the Elbe, the Soviet tankers sliced through the enemy, even though, as Rybalko noted, German divisions that had not been wiped out still remained behind us. In 24 hours, fighting all the way, Rybalko made a blazing run of 38 miles. Lelyushenko's tanks drove 28 miles. Now Rybalko exultantly phoned Koniev. "Comrade Marshal," he said, "we are fighting on the outskirts of Zossen." Elements of the 1st Ukrainians were now only 25 miles from Berlin. At Zossen the alarm had been sounded. It now seemed likely that the Soviets would reach the High Command headquarters within 24 hours, and the order had been given to move. Key officers had left already for a new command post near Potsdam. The remainder of the headquarters personnel, along with the office typewriters, decoding machines, safes, and crates of documents, were loaded into buses and trucks. As the packing and loading went on, people walked about anxiously, eager to get going. At that moment, said General Erich Dethlefsen, who had taken over Krebs's old job as Assistant Chief of Staff, "We offered the enemy air force a rewarding target." Shortly before dark, the convoys moved out, heading for Bavaria. Dethlefsen, driving toward Berlin to attend the Führer's night conference, was happy to see a flight of Luftwaffe planes heading over him going south. Later at the briefing, he heard a Luftwaffe officer tell Hitler about a successful attack upon Soviet tanks pushing towards Zossen to defend the area from attack. The bombers of the Luftwaffe had been more than successful. The Soviet tanks had been the buses and trucks of the OKH command column heading south. The Germans had shot up their own convoy. At midnight on April 20th, Heinrici grimly surveyed his maps and tried to analyse the situation. A few hours earlier, one of his fears had been realised. He now commanded not only the Army Group Vistula, but Berlin as well. Almost immediately upon receiving the order, he had called Rehmann and told him that no bridges were to be destroyed in the city. Rehmann had complained that the city was defenceless anyway, now that the best part of his Volkssturm had been pulled out to man defence lines. Heinrici knew all about it. In fact, he now told Rehmann to send along the remainder of the Home Guard. "Rehmann," said Heinrici wearily, "don't you understand what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to make sure that fighting takes place outside the city and not in it." Under the present circumstances, Heinrici knew, Berlin could not be defended. He had no intention of allowing his armies to fall back into the city. Tanks would not be able to manoeuvre there. Because of the buildings, artillery could not be used. They would have no field of fire. Furthermore, if any attempt was made to fight in the city, there would be an enormous loss of civilian life. At all costs, Heinrici hoped to avoid the horror of block-to-block, street-to-street fighting. His main concern at the moment was Buss's army. He was sure that if it was not pulled back quickly, it would be encircled. Before leaving for the front early in the morning, he had given a message to his chief of staff for Krebs. "I cannot accept responsibility or direct this situation if Buss's army is not withdrawn immediately, and have him tell that to the Führer." Then he had driven all over the front. Signs of disintegration were everywhere. He saw roads covered with the vehicles of refugees, often with military transport among them. For the first time he ran into troops who were obviously retreating. On the way to Eberswalde, he noted, "I didn't find one soldier who didn't claim to have orders to get munitions, fuel, or something else from the rear." He was appalled and swung into action. North of Eberswalde, he found men marching toward the northwest, saying that their division was to be reformed near Joachimsthal. He stopped them and reorganized them near Eberswalde. At canal crossing points in the same area, he found parts of the 4th SS Police Division being unloaded. They were young, newly organized, but only partially armed. They had been told they would get weapons in Eberswalde. South of there, he found the road jammed with a mass of civilians and soldiers. Heinrici got out of his car and ordered the non-commissioned officers to turn their men around. "Go back to the front," he said. In the town of Schönholz, he saw younger officers inactive and just looking around. They had to be energetically ordered to build a line to catch scattered troops. The forests between there and Trampe were filled with groups of soldiers either resting or retreating. No one claimed to have any orders or assignments. In another area, he discovered a tank reconnaissance section resting next to its parked vehicles. He ordered the unit to move on Biesenthal at once and recapture this very important crossroads. There was so much confusion around Eberswalde, Heinrici later recalled, that no one could tell me if a front existed at all. But by midnight, he had restored order in the region and had issued fresh commands. It was clear that his forces were undermanned, underarmed, and often without competent leadership, and Heinrici knew that the front could not hold for long. Von Manteuffel's Third Panzer Army in the north had achieved some defensive success against Rokossowski, but it was only a question of time before von Manteuffel would be forced to retreat also. At 12:30 a.m. he called Krebs. He told him that the situation was becoming almost impossible to control. In particular, he talked about the 56th Panzer Corps, which, in spite of all counterattacks against the Soviets, is being pushed farther and farther back. The situation there, he said, was tense to the point of bursting. Twice during the day he had talked personally to Krebs about the Ninth Army's rapidly worsening situation. Each time, Krebs had again given him the Führer's decision: Busse is to hold on the Oder. Now Heinrici fought for Busse again. "Consistently," Heinrici told Krebs now, "I have been denied freedom of movement for the Ninth Army. Now I demand it, before it's too late. I must point out that I am not resisting the Führer's orders because of stubbornness or unjustified pessimism. From my record in Russia, you know that I do not give up easily, but it is essential to act now in order to save the Ninth from destruction. I have received the order," he said, "that the army group must hold the front line in its present positions, and that all available forces must be pulled out to close the gap between the 9th and Schöne on the southern flank. I regret what I'm going to say with all my heart, but the order cannot be carried out. The move simply has no chance of success. I demand the approval of my request to withdraw the 9th Army. It is in the interest of the Führer himself that I make this request." "Actually," said Heinrici, "what I should do is go to the Führer and say, 'My Führer, since this order endangers your well-being, has no chance of success and cannot be carried out, I request you to relieve me of command and give it to somebody else. Then I could do my duty as a Volkssturm man and fight the enemy.'" Heinrici was putting his cards squarely on the table. He was stating to his superior officer that he would rather fight in the lowest ranks than carry out an order that could result only in the useless sacrifice of lives. "Do you really want me to pass this on to the Führer?" asked Krebs. Heinrici's answer was short. "I demand it," he said. "My chief of staff and my operations officers are my witnesses." A short while later, Krebs rang back. The 9th was to hold its position. At the same time, all forces that could be made available were to try to close the gap with Schöne on the southern flank, so as to set up a continuous front once more. Heinrici knew then that the 9th was as good as lost. In the Führer bunker, Hitler's nightly military conference broke up at 3 a.m. during the meeting. Hitler had blamed the Fourth Army, the army that had been crushed by Koniev's attack in the opening day of his offensive, for all the problems that had since arisen. He accused the army of treason. "My Führer," asked General Dethlefsen, shocked, "do you really believe that the command committed treason?" Hitler looked at Dethlefsen with pitying eyes, as if only a fool could ask such a stupid question. Then he said, "All our failures in the East can be traced to treachery, nothing else but treachery." As Dethlefsen was about to leave the room, Ambassador Walter Huell, von Ribbentrop's representative from the Foreign Ministry, entered, his expression deeply concerned. "My Führer," he said. "Do you have any orders for me?" There was a pause, and then Hewell said, "If we still want to achieve anything on a diplomatic level, now is the time." According to Dethlefsen, Hitler, in a voice soft and completely changed, said, "Politics. I have nothing to do with politics anymore. That just disgusts me." He walked toward the door. Slowly, recalls Dethlefsen, tired and with flagging gait. Then he turned and said to Hewell, "When I am dead, you will have to busy yourself plenty with politics." Jewell pressed. "I think we should do something now," he said. As Hitler got to the door, Jewell added most earnestly, "My Führer, it is 5 seconds before 12. Hitler seemed not to hear Dot. The Ruhr pocket was completely erased by April 18th. 3 days later, Model committed suicide. Goering may have had even more than 24 trucks. Heinrici believes he had 4 columns. This, however, may have included the additional Luftwaffe convoys that left Berlin later in the day. The fantastic fact is that at this moment, with planes grounded and vehicles unable to move because of fuel, Goering had at his disposal not only trucks, but ample supplies of gasoline. Completely surrounded in the Baltic states, the remnants of the Courland army were finally evacuated by boat and arrived at Swinemünde at the beginning of April. Of the 18 divisions, only a few boatloads of men, minus equipment, reached Germany. Hitler's remark to Jodl was written down by Louise Jodl in her detailed diary. The entry is followed by this note: "My husband remarked that save for one other occasion, after the death of my first wife, this is the only personal remark Hitler has ever made to me." Testimony at the Nuremberg trials disclosed that Grawitz, in his additional capacity as Himmler's chief surgeon, had authorized medical experiments on concentration camp inmates. It was exactly 11:30 a.m., Saturday, April 21st. Berlin had become the front line. Shells now began to strike everywhere. Tongues of flame leaped from rooftops all over the center of the city. Bomb-weakened buildings collapsed. Automobiles were upended and set afire. The Brandenburg Gate was hit, and one cornice crashed down into the street. Shells ploughed the Unter den Linden from one end to the other. The royal palace, already wrecked, burst into flames again. So did the Reichstag. The girders that had once supported the building's cupola collapsed, and hunks of metal showered down. People ran wildly along the Kurfürstendamm, dropping briefcases and packages, bobbing frantically from doorway to doorway. At the Tiergarten end of the street, a stable of riding horses received a direct hit. The screams of the animals mingled with the cries and shouts of men and women. An instant later, the horses stampeded out of the inferno and dashed down the Kurfürstendamm, their manes and tails blazing. Barrage after barrage pounded the city, systematically and methodically. Correspondent Max Schnetzer of the Swiss paper Der Bund, standing by the Brandenburg Gate, noted that in the center of the government section of Wilhelmstrasse at least one shell was landing every 5 seconds. Then there would be a pause of half a minute or a minute, and once again the shells would start to fall. From where he stood, the newspaper man could see fires shooting up toward the skies from the direction of the Friedrichstrasse station. Because the smoke and haze diffuses the light, he later wrote, it looks as if the very clouds are on fire. The shelling was just as intense in other parts of the city. In Wilmersdorf, Ilse Ants, her mother and sister, felt their building shudder. The 2 girls threw themselves to the floor. Their mother clung to the doorpost, screaming, "My God! My God! My God!" In Neukölln, Dora Janssen watched her husband, a Wehrmacht major, walk down the driveway to his limousine. The major's Batman opened the car door and suddenly was torn completely to pieces by a shell. When the dust cleared, she saw her husband still standing by the car, his head high but his face distorted with pain. As Frau Janssen ran toward the major, she saw that one leg of his trousers was soaked in blood which was running over his boot and onto the sidewalk. Later, as she watched him being carried away on a stretcher, she found a curious emotion competing with her concern for her husband's safety. She could not help thinking, how upright he stood in spite of his injury. A real officer! Not far away was another officer who had never believed that the Russians could come this close. The fanatical Luftwaffe accountant, Captain Gotthard Karl, who still greeted his family with the Hitler salute, was growing desperate. As the Russians had come closer, Karl's sartorial splendour had gleamed undiminished. Indeed, it had become even more evident. Though she would never dare tell him so, his wife Gerda thought Karl looked ridiculous in his gala dress uniform, complete with gold cufflinks and rows of meaningless ribbons. These days, too, he was never without his signet ring, on which a swastika was outlined in diamonds. But Gotthard Karl was fully aware of the turn events were taking. Returning home at noon from his Tempelhof office, he threw up his hand in his usual Heil Hitler greeting, and then gave his wife some instructions. "Now that the bombardment has begun," he told her, "you are to go to the cellar and remain there permanently. I want you to sit right opposite the cellar entrance." Gerda looked at him in amazement. It seemed the least safe place to be. But Gotthard was insistent. "I have heard that in other cities the Russians enter the cellars with flamethrowers, and most people are burned alive. I want you to sit directly before the cellar door so that you will be killed first. You won't have to sit and wait your turn." Then, without another word, he clasped his wife's hands, gave the Nazi salute, and walked out of the apartment. Numbly, Gerda did as she was told. Sitting well ahead of the other occupants, and just inside the entrance to the shelter, she prayed steadily as the bombardment raged overhead. For the first time since their marriage, she did not include Gotthard in her prayers. In the afternoon, at the time her husband usually arrived home, Gerda, defying his orders, ventured upstairs. Trembling and frightened, she waited a while, but Gotthard did not return. She never saw him again. The artillery shelling had begun just as the aerial bombing ended. The last Western air raid on Berlin, the 363rd of the war, was delivered at 9:25 a.m. by elements of the U.S. 8th Air Force. For 44 months, the Americans and British had pounded Big B, as the U.S. flyers called it. Berliners had shaken their fists at the bombers, mourned the deaths of friends and relatives, and the destruction of their homes. Yet their anger, like the bombs themselves, had been impersonal, directed at men they would never see. The shelling was different. It came from an enemy who stood outside their doors, who would soon be facing them. There was another difference, too. Berliners had learned to live with the bombing and to anticipate the almost clock-like regularity of the raids. Most people could tell by the very whistle of a falling bomb approximately where it would land. Many had grown so accustomed to the raids that often they did not even bother to seek shelter. Artillery fire was somehow more dangerous. Shells landed suddenly and unexpectedly. The razor-sharp, scythe-like shrapnel ripped and cut in every direction, often striking yards away from the initial explosion. Journalist Hans Wüller-Wahlberg, making his way across Potsdamer Platz as it was raked by shell bursts, saw dead and dying everywhere. It seemed to him that some people had been killed by the blast of air pressure, which had torn out their lungs. As he dodged the bursts, the thought struck him that Berliners, formerly bound together against their common enemy, the bombers, now had no time to bother about the dead and the wounded. Everyone was too busy trying to save his own skin. The merciless shelling had no pattern. It was aimless and incessant. Each day it seemed to increase in intensity. Mortars and the grinding howl of rocket-firing Katushkas soon added to the din. Most people now spent much of their time in cellars, air raid shelters, flak tower bunkers, and subway stations. They lost all sense of time. The days blurred amid the fear, confusion, and death that was all about them. Berliners who had kept meticulous diaries up to April 21st suddenly got their dates mixed. Many wrote that the Russians were in the centre of the city on April 21st or 22, when the Red Army was still fighting in the suburbs. Their terror of the Russians was often intensified by a certain guilty knowledge. Some Germans, at least, knew all about the way German troops had behaved on Soviet soil and about the terrible and secret atrocities committed by the Third Reich in concentration camps. Over Berlin, as the Russians drew closer, hung a nightmarish fear unlike that experienced by any city since the razing of Carthage. Elfriede Wassermann and her husband Erich had taken shelter in the huge bunker next to the Anhalter railway station. Erich had lost his left leg on the Russian front in 1943 and could walk only with the aid of crutches. He had quickly recognized the sound of the artillery fire for what it was and had rushed his wife off to the bunker. Elfriede had packed their belongings in 2 suitcases and 2 other large bags. Over her own clothes, she put on a pair of Erich's old military pants and, on top of everything, both her woolen and fur coats. Since her husband needed both hands for his crutches, she had strapped one bag on his back and the other across his chest. One of the parcels contained food, some hard-crusted bread and a few tins of meat and vegetables. In one of her suitcases, Elfriede had a large pot of butter. By the time they reached the Anhalter station, its bunker was already jammed. Elfriede finally found them a place on one of the stairway landings. A single weak light hung above their heads. In its glow, people could be seen crowding every foot of floor space and every stairway of the building. Conditions in the bunker were unbelievable. The floor above was reserved for the wounded, and their screams could be heard night and day. Toilets could not be used because there was no water. Excrement was everywhere. The stench was nauseating at first, but after a time Elfriede and Erich no longer noticed it. They passed the hours in a state of complete apathy, hardly talking, unaware of what was happening outside. Only one thing intruded on their private thoughts: the continuous screaming of children. Many parents had run out of supplies of food and milk. Elfriede saw 3 small babies being carried down from the floor above, all of them dead from lack of food. Next to Elfriede sat a young woman with a 3-month-old infant. At some point during their stay in the bunker, Elfriede noticed that the baby was no longer in the mother's arms. It was lying on the concrete floor next to Elfriede, dead. The mother seemed dazed. So was Elfriede. She remembers that I simply saw that the child was dead without being upset in any way. On Potsdamer Strasse, the House of Tourist Affairs was being shelled. In the 44-room underground shelter, there were more than 2,000 people, and Margarete Promiest, who was in charge of the shelter, had her hands full. Besides civilians, 2 battalions of Volkssturm had recently been moved in because, Margarete was told, the Russians are getting closer. Harried and near exhaustion, Margarete had been more than grateful for the telephone call she had received a short time before. A close friend had volunteered to bring her some food. Now, as she moved about the shelter, 44 wounded civilians were brought down from the street. Margarete hurried over to assist with the casualties. One of them was beyond help, and as she sat quietly beside the dead body of the woman who had come to bring her food, Margarete envied her quiet and peaceful smile. She, at least, has been spared our Via Dolorosa. While most people were going underground for the duration of the battle, druggist Hans Mieder patrolled his beat as air raid warden for the public shelter at Bismarckstrasse 61 in Charlottenburg. As shells exploded all about him, he looked balefully at a poster on the wall of the building opposite the shelter. The text, printed in gigantic letters, read, "The hour before sunrise is the darkest." For Dr. Rudolf Huckel, the sunrise was far away. For weeks now, the eminent pathologist had been a source of deep worry to his wife Anne-Maria. She believed he was headed for a nervous breakdown. Sometime earlier, he had shown her a cyanide capsule whose deadly potency he had improved upon by the addition of acetic acid. He had told her then that if Berlin's situation worsened, they would commit suicide. Since then, Frau Huckel had seen how the intensity of the war, its senselessness, and my husband's rage against Hitler had all gotten the best of him. Now the limit of Dr. Huckel's endurance had been reached. After hours of listening to the screaming of shells, the doctor suddenly got up, ran to the open window, and yelled out at the top of his voice, "Der Kerl muss umgebracht werden! That fellow, Hitler, must be bumped off." Hitler's finger stabbed the map. "Steiner! Steiner! Steiner!" he shouted. The Führer had found the answer. SS General Felix Steiner and his troops, he cried, were to attack immediately from their positions in Eberswalde on the flank of von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army. Then they were to head south, cutting off the Russians' drive on Berlin. Steiner's attack would close the gap that had opened when the northern flank of Busse's Ninth Army crumpled. On Hitler's map, it appeared a brilliant move. Zhukov's drive now looked like an arrowhead, its base on the Oder, its tip pointing directly at Berlin. Along Zhukov's northern flank was the little flag that said, Group Steiner. Hitler was confident once more. Steiner's attack would re-establish contact between the Third and Ninth Armies. There was only one thing wrong with the Führer's scheme. Steiner had virtually no men. Earlier, Heinrici had decided to place under Steiner the Ninth Army troops that had been shoved to the north by the Russian drive. Unfortunately, the widespread confusion at the front and the lack of time had made it impossible to gather sufficient forces to make the Group Steiner operational. In effect, there was no Group Steiner, but the name had stuck, and so had the little flag on Hitler's map. Now Hitler phoned Steiner. "As I remember the call," Steiner said, "it reached me between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Hitler's exact words were, 'Steiner, are you aware that the Reichsmarschall, Göring, has a private army at Karinhal? This is to be disbanded at once and sent into battle.' While I was trying to figure out what that was supposed to mean, he continued, 'Every available man between Berlin and the Baltic Sea up to Stettin and Hamburg is to be drawn into this attack I have ordered.' When I protested, saying that the troops at my disposal were inexperienced, and when I asked precisely where the attack was to take place, the Führer gave me no answer. He simply hung up. I had no idea where or when or with what I was to attack. Steiner called Krebs, explained his situation, and told the chief of OKH that he did not have troops. Then I recall Hitler cutting in on the conversation. At that moment I was explaining to Krebs that my troops were totally inexperienced and that we had no heavy weapons. Hitler gave me a long lecture and closed with these words. "You will see, Steiner, you will see. The Russians will suffer their greatest defeat before the gates of Berlin." I told him that I thought the Berlin situation was hopeless. I was completely ignored. Shortly thereafter, Steiner received the official order to attack. The last paragraphs read, "It is expressly forbidden to fall back to the west. Officers who do not comply unconditionally with this order are to be arrested and shot right away. You, Steiner, are liable with your head for the execution of this order. The fate of the Reich capital depends on the success of your mission. Adolf Hitler." After his conversation with Steiner, Hitler called the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff, General Kohler. "All Air Force personnel in the northern zone who can be made available are to be placed at the disposal of Steiner and brought to him," Hitler said, his voice rising. "Any commanding officer who keeps back personnel will forfeit his life within 5 hours. They must be told of this." Then he screamed, "You, yourself, will guarantee with your own head that absolutely every man is employed." Kohler was dumbfounded. It was the first he had heard of Group Steiner. He called General Dethlefsen at OKH and asked, "Where is Steiner? Where should our troops be sent?" Dethlefsen did not know, but promised to find out as quickly as possible. Throughout this frantic period, one man, Heinrici, knew nothing at all about the scheme. When he finally heard, he called Krebs. "Steiner does not have the strength to make such an attack," Heinrici said angrily. "I reject the order. I insist on the withdrawal of the Ninth Army. Otherwise, Krebs, the only troop unit still in position to defend Hitler and Berlin, will be lost. Now I tell you, if this final request is not approved, then I must demand to be released from my post." Could he, Heinrici suggested, have an appointment with Hitler to discuss the situation? Krebs flatly vetoed the idea. "It's just not possible," he said. "The Führer is overworked." For the record, Heinrici noted the outcome of the conversation in his personal war diary. "My appeal to the highest officials to bear in mind the responsibilities they bore to the troops was rejected with the words, 'That responsibility is borne by the Führer.'" The life of Army Group Vistula was drawing to a close. Certainly. Here's the continuation and completion of the text. Quickly he found Herbert and offered him the precious release order. To his astonishment, Herbert refused it. Because he was condemned to death, the Gestapo would capture him no matter what, Herbert said. Kurt had been imprisoned only as a suspected communist. He had not been charged with anything. "You'll have a better chance," Herbert told his brother. "You go." Then he added with false enthusiasm, "We'll all probably get out today in any case, so you might as well go first." A short time later, his bedroll over his shoulder, Kurt Kosny walked into the guard room on the main floor and joined a line of Jehovah's Witnesses being processed out. One of the guards, an SS sergeant named Bathe, who knew Kurt, looked right at him. For one awful moment, Kurt expected to be grabbed and hauled back to the cellar, but Bathe turned away. The man behind the desk said, "Next." Kurt presented his slip. 5 minutes later, his official stamped release in hand, Kurt Kosny stood in the street outside the prison. He was a free man. The street was being swept with gunfire, and the air was thick with shrapnel, but Kurt Kosny hardly noticed. He felt deliriously happy, as though I had drunk about 20 brandies. The Russians were in Zossen. General Rybalko's Third Guards tankers had captured the High Command headquarters intact, along with a handful of engineers, soldiers and technicians. Everyone else had gone. Rybalko's tired, begrimed tankers blinked in amazement at the brilliant lighting in the vast underground rooms. As they wandered through galleries, living quarters and offices, evidence of a speedy exodus was apparent everywhere. Major Boris Polovoy, a political commissar attached to Koniev's headquarters, saw that the floors were littered with maps and papers. In one room, a dressing gown lay on a desk. Nearby was a leather case filled with family photographs. Exchange 500, the huge telephone complex, had been seized undamaged. Men stood on the threshold and gaped at the flickering lights on the consoles, all now unmanned. Large signs attached to the telephone boards warned in schoolbook Russian, "Soldiers, do not damage this apparatus. It will be valuable to the Red Army." Polovoy and the other officers speculated that fleeing German workers had put up the signs in order to save their own necks. Among the men captured in the command centre had been Hans Beltow, the chief engineer of the complex electrical systems, and now he showed the Russians around Exchange 500. One operator, Beltow explained through Russian women interpreters, had stayed until just before the headquarters was overrun. As wire recorders played out his last conversations, the Russians stood listening in the great immaculate room. During Zossen's final minutes in German hands, calls had continued to come in from all over the swiftly contracting Reich, and they were all there on the recorders. "I have an urgent message for Oslo," a voice said in German. "Sorry," said the Zossen operator, "but we're not transmitting. I'm the last man here." "My God, what's happening?" Another voice. "Attention, attention, I have an urgent message." "We aren't accepting any messages." "Is there any contact with Prague? How are they feeling in Berlin?" "Ivan is almost at the door. I'm closing down now." Zossen had fallen. Except for this brief inspection, Koniev's armies had hardly paused there. One tentacle of tanks was heading for Potsdam, another had already crossed the Nutter Canal and reached Lichtenrade, south of the Berlin district of Tempelhof. Other tankers pushed on to Teltow and were now crashing through the defences south of the Teltow Canal. Beyond lay the districts of Zehlendorf and Steglitz. By nightfall of April 22nd, Koniev's armies had cracked Berlin's southern defences and had beaten Zhukov into Berlin by more than a full day. In the Führerbunker, the customary military conference began at 3 p.m. In the 12-year history of the Third Reich, there had never been a day like this. The usual outpourings of optimism were missing. The Oder front had all but crumpled. The Ninth Army was virtually encircled. Its strongest unit, the 56th Panzer Corps, was lost for the moment and could not be found. Steiner had been unable to attack. Berlin was almost encircled. Commanders were being replaced almost hourly. The Reich was in its death agonies, and the man who had brought it all about now gave up. Hitler's announcement climaxed a wild, uncontrolled torrent of abuse in which he denounced his generals, his advisers, his armies, and the people of Germany whom he had led to disaster. The end had come, Hitler sputtered. Everything was falling apart. He was no longer able to continue. He had decided to remain in Berlin. He intended to take over the defense of the city personally, and at the last moment he meant to shoot himself. General Krebs and the Luftwaffe representative, General Eckhard Christian, were horror-stricken. To both, Hitler seemed to have suffered a complete breakdown. Jodl alone remained calm, for Hitler had told the operations chief all of this 48 hours before. Everyone present tried to persuade the almost deranged Führer that all was not lost. He must remain in charge of the Reich, they said, and he must leave Berlin, for it was impossible to control matters from the capital any longer. The man who had held their world together now brutally rejected them. He was remaining in Berlin, Hitler said. The others could go where they pleased. Everyone was thunderstruck. To emphasize that he meant what he said, Hitler stated that he intended to make a public announcement of his presence in Berlin. There and then he dictated a statement to be broadcast immediately. The others managed to persuade him not to release it right away. The announcement would not be made until the next day. Meanwhile, the officers and aides in the bunker called on their colleagues outside the city to bring additional pressure on the Führer. Himmler, Dönitz, and even Göring telephoned, pleading, like their comrades, for a change of mind. Hitler would not be dissuaded. Jodl was called away to the phone. While he was gone, Keitel, trying to reason with Hitler, asked to speak to him privately. The conference room was cleared. According to Keitel's account, he told Hitler that he saw two courses of action still open: to make an offer of capitulation before Berlin became a battlefield, or to arrange for Hitler to fly to Berchtesgaden and from there instantly begin negotiations. Hitler, according to Keitel, did not let me get beyond these words. He interrupted and said, "I have made this decision already. I shall not leave Berlin. I shall defend the city to the end. Either I win this battle for the Reich's capital, or I shall fall as a symbol of the Reich." Keitel thought this decision was madness. "I must insist," he told Hitler, "that you leave for Berchtesgaden this very night." Hitler refused to hear any more. He called back Jodl and, in a private conference with the two officers, gave us his order that we were to fly to Berchtesgaden and from there take over the reins together with Göring, who was Hitler's deputy. "In 7 years," Keitel protested, "I have never refused to carry out an order from you, but this one I shall not carry out. You can't leave the Wehrmacht in the lurch." Hitler replied, "I am staying here. That is certain." Then Jodl suggested that Wenck's army could drive toward Berlin from its positions on the Elbe. Keitel declared that he would immediately travel to the Western Front, see General Wenck, relieve him of all previous commands, and order him to march toward Berlin and link up with the Ninth Army. At last, Hitler had heard a suggestion he could approve. It seemed to Keitel that the proposal brought a certain relief to Hitler in this absolutely dreadful situation. Soon after, Keitel left for Wenck's headquarters. Some officers who were not at the conference, such as the Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff, General Karl Kohler, were so astonished by the news of the Führer's collapse that they refused to believe the reports of their own representatives on the scene. Kohler rushed to Jodl's latest headquarters at Krampnitz, 5 miles northeast of Potsdam, and got a verbatim report. "What you've heard is correct," Jodl told Kohler. He also told the Luftwaffe Chief of Staff that Hitler had given up and intended to commit suicide at the last minute. Hitler said that he could not take part in the fighting for physical reasons, and that he would not do so because of the danger of falling into the enemy's hands, perhaps when he was only wounded. "We all tried to dissuade him. Hitler," Jodl went on, "said he was no longer able to continue, and that now it was up to the Reichsmarschall. In answer to a remark that troops would not fight for Göring, the Führer said, 'What do you mean, fight? There's not much fighting to be done, and when it comes to negotiating, the Reichsmarschall can do that better than I.'" Jodl added that Hitler said the troops are no longer fighting, the tank barricades in Berlin are open and are no longer being defended. In the Führer bunker, it was clear by now that Hitler had meant every word he had said. He spent hours selecting documents and papers, which were then taken out into the courtyard and burned. Then he sent for Goebbels, Frau Goebbels, and their children. They were to stay with him in the bunker until the end. Dr. Werner Naumann, Goebbels' assistant, had known for some time that Goebbels felt that the only decent course of conduct in the event of collapse was to fall in battle or commit suicide. Magda Goebbels, the Reichsminister's wife, felt the same way. When he heard of the Goebbels' impending move to the Chancellery, Naumann knew that they would all die there together. Goebbels' contempt for the traitorous and unworthy was almost equal to Hitler's. The day before the Führer's outburst, he called his propaganda staff together and said, "The German people have failed. In the east they are running away. In the west they are receiving the enemy with white flags. The German people themselves chose their destiny. I forced no one to be my co-worker. Why did you work with me? Now your little throats are going to be cut. But believe me, when we take our leave, earth will tremble." By Hitler's standards, it almost seemed that the only loyal Germans were those who now planned suicide and buried themselves in their own tombs. On this very evening, gangs of SS men were searching houses looking for deserters. Punishment was swift. On nearby Alexanderplatz, 16-year-old Eva Knoblauch, a refugee recently arrived in Berlin, saw the body of a young Wehrmacht private hanging from a lamppost. There was a large white card tied to the dead man's legs. It read, "Traitor, I deserted my people." All through this decisive day, Heinrici had waited for the news that he felt must come, that Hitler had given permission for the Ninth Army to withdraw. Buss's force, almost encircled and cut off from the armies on its flanks, was close to annihilation. Yet Krebs had continued to insist that it hold its positions. He had gone even further. He had suggested that some of the Ninth's forces attempt to fight their way south and link up with Field Marshal Schörner. Buss himself was complicating matters. Heinrici had tried to get him to pull back without orders. Buss refused even to consider withdrawal unless a specific command arrived from the Führer. At 11 a.m. on April 22nd, Heinrici warned Krebs that the Ninth would be split into several parts by nightfall. Krebs confidently predicted that Field Marshal Schörner would right the situation by driving north to link up with Busse. Heinrici knew better. "It will take Schörner several days to mount an attack," he told Krebs. "By then the Ninth will no longer exist." Hour by hour the situation grew more desperate, and Heinrici repeatedly urged Krebs to do something. "You nail my forces down," he stormed, "while you tell me that I must do all I can to avoid the shame of the Führer being encircled in Berlin. Against my will, in spite of my request to be relieved of my duties, I am being prevented from pulling out the only forces that can be used for the protection of the Führer and Berlin." The Führer's headquarters was not only making difficulties over Busse, now it was demanding that von Manteuffel's Third Army throw Rokossowski's forces back across the Oder, an order so impossible to carry out that Heinrici could only gasp when he received it. At 12:10 p.m. Heinrici warned Krebs, "It is my conviction that this is the last moment to withdraw the Ninth Army." 2 hours later he called again, but Krebs had already left for the Führer's conference. To General Dethlefsen, Heinrici said, "We must have a decision." At 2:50, Krebs called Heinrici. The Führer had agreed that some of the Ninth Army's forces could be moved back along the outer northern wing, giving up Frankfurt. Heinrici snorted. It was a half measure that would do little to improve the situation. He did not point out to Krebs that the city had been held steadily by Colonel Bieler, the man Hitler had decided was no Gneisenau. Now Bieler would find it difficult to disengage. In any event, the approval had come too late. The Ninth was encircled. Nearly 2 hours later, Krebs again came on the phone. This time he informed Heinrici that at the Führer's conference it had been decided to turn General Wenck's 12th Army away from its positions on the Western Front. Wenck would launch an attack toward the east and Berlin, relieving the pressure. It was a surprising announcement. Heinrici commented dryly, "They will be most welcome." But still no order of complete withdrawal had come for the Ninth. Although they were encircled, Heinrici believed Busse's troops were still strong enough to begin moving toward the west. Now Krebs's news of Wenck, whom Heinrici had never even heard of before this moment, offered a new possibility. The news gave rise to the hope Heinrici said later, that the 9th could still be rescued from its precarious situation after all. Heinrici called Buss. "Krebs just told me that the Army Wenck is to turn about and march in your direction," he said. He instructed Buss to pull out his strongest division, break through the Russians, and head west to meet Wenck. Buss protested that this would lose him the bulk of his strength. Heinrici had had enough. "This is the order for the 9th Army," he interrupted in a steely voice. "Pull out one division and get it underway to join with Wenck." He was finished arguing. All around the rim of the city, a red glow tinged the night sky. Fires pockmarked nearly every district, and the shelling was ceaseless. But in the cellar of the Lehrterstrasse prison, a feeling of jubilance and excitement had been mounting steadily. During the afternoon, 21 men had been freed. Later, some of the remaining prisoners' valuables had been returned. According to the guards, the action had been authorized to speed up the processing of releases. At any moment now, the prisoners expected to be freed. Some thought they might be home before morning. Even Herbert Kosny now felt that he had beaten the executioner. A guard came into the cellar. From a list in his hand, he quickly began to read off names. The men listened tensely as each name was called. There was a communist, a Russian POW, and several men whom Kosny recognized as suspects in the Hitler plot of 1944. The guard reeled off the names. Haushofer, Schleicher, Munzinger, Sosinau, Kosny, Moll. Suddenly, Herbert realized with a surge of hope that his name had been called. Altogether, some 16 prisoners had been singled out. When they had been counted, the guard led them to the security office. There they waited outside the door as, one after another, each man was called in. When Kosny's turn came, he saw that there were 6 SS men in the room, all quite drunk. One of them looked up his name and gave him the personal belongings taken from him at the time of his arrest. They were pitifully few: his army paybook, a pencil, and a cigarette lighter. Herbert signed a receipt for his effects, and then a form stating that he had been released. One of the SS men told him, "Well, you'll see your wife pretty soon." Back in the cellar, the men were told to pack their belongings. Kosny could hardly believe his luck. He packed quickly, carefully folding the good suit his wife had given him on their 4th wedding anniversary. When he had finished, he began to help his fellow prisoner Haushofer. Among Haushofer's belongings was some food, including a bottle of wine and a loaf of pumpernickel. Haushofer could not get the bread into his rucksack, so he gave it to Kosny. There was a long wait. Then, after almost an hour and a half, the 16 men were lined up in a double row and led up the cellar steps, through a door, and into a dark hall. Suddenly, a door slammed shut behind them, and they were left standing in total darkness. Almost immediately, a flashlight was switched on. As Herbert's eyes grew accustomed to the dimness, he saw that the light was hanging from an SS officer's belt. The man, a lieutenant colonel, was wearing a helmet and carried a gun. "You are being transferred," he told the men. "If there are any attempts at escape, you will be shot down. Load your things onto the truck outside. We'll march to the Potsdam railroad station." Kosny's hopes were dashed. For a moment he thought of darting into one of the nearby cells. He was now certain that the Russians would be in the area within a few hours. But even as he considered hiding, he realized that other SS men, carrying machine pistols, were standing all about the room. The prisoners were herded out into the Lehrterstrasse and marched off in the direction of Invalidenstrasse. It was raining. Herbert turned up his jacket collar and tied a towel he was using as a scarf tighter around his throat. Halfway down the street, the men were stopped and searched, and their personal effects, which had been returned to them only a short while earlier, were taken again. The column set off once more, each prisoner flanked by an SS man with a machine pistol on his back and a gun in his hand. As they reached Invalidenstrasse, an SS sergeant suggested taking a shortcut through the bombed-out Ulap exhibition hall. They marched through the rubble and entered the ruins of the massive building with its skeletal concrete pillars. Suddenly, each prisoner was grabbed by the collar by his SS guard. One group of prisoners went to the left, the other to the right. They were marched right up to the wall of the building and positioned about 6 to 7 feet apart. And then they all knew what was going to happen. Some prisoners began to plead for their lives. The man next to Cosney began to scream, "Let me live! I haven't done anything!" At that moment, Herbert felt the cold barrel of a pistol touching the back of his neck. Just as the sergeant shouted, "Fire!" Herbert turned his head. There was a ragged volley as each SS man fired. Cosney felt a sudden sharp blow. Then he was on the ground. He lay motionless. Now the lieutenant colonel walked along the line of fallen men, firing an additional shot into the head of each prisoner. When he got to Herbert, he said, "This pig has had enough." Then he said, "Come on, men, we must hurry. We have more work to do tonight." Cosney never knew how long he lay there. After a time, very cautiously, he put his hand up to his neck and cheek. He was bleeding profusely, but his life had been saved in that split second when he turned his head. He found that he could not use his right arm or leg. Crawling, he slowly made his way through the ruins until he reached Invalidenstrasse. Then he got up, found he could walk, tied the towel even more tightly about his wounded throat, and slowly, painfully started in the direction of the Charité hospital. He collapsed several times. Once he was stopped by a group of Hitler youths. They first demanded his identity papers, but then, seeing that he was badly hurt, they allowed him to pass. At some point in his journey he took his shoes off because they felt too heavy. At another time he encountered heavy artillery fire. How long the walk took he could never remember. He was never more than half conscious. But finally he reached his home off Franzeckestrasse. Then, with his last ounce of strength, Herbert Cosney, the only living witness to the Lerterstrasse prison massacre, banged again and again on the door. His wife Hedwig opened the door. The man who stood there was unrecognizable. His face was a mass of blood, as was the front of his coat. Horrified, she said, "Who are you?" Just before he collapsed, Cosney managed to say, "I'm Herbert." At 1 a.m. on April 23rd, the phone rang in the Wiesenberg Forest headquarters of General Walter Wenck, commander of the 12th Army. The Wehrmacht's youngest general was still in uniform, dozing in an armchair. His command post, Alte Holle, Old Hell, about 35 miles east of Magdeburg, was the former home of a gamekeeper. Wenck picked up the phone himself. One of his commanders reported that Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel had just passed through the lines, en route to the headquarters. Wenck called his chief of staff, Colonel Gunther Reichhelm. "We have a visitor coming," he said. Keitel. Wenck had always heartily disliked Hitler's chief of staff. Keitel was the last man in the world he wanted to talk to now. In the last few weeks, Wenck had seen more sorrow, hardship and suffering than he had ever witnessed in battle. As Germany's boundaries shrank, his area had become a vast refugee encampment. Homeless Germans were everywhere, along the roads, in the fields, villages and forests, sleeping in wagons, tents, broken-down trucks, railway carriages, and in the open. Wenck had turned every habitable building in the area, homes, churches, even village dance halls, into shelters for the refugees. "I felt," he said later, "like a visiting priest. Every day I went around trying to do what I could for the refugees, particularly the children and the sick. And all the time we wondered how soon the Americans would attack from their bridgeheads across the Elbe." His army was now feeding more than 500,000 people a day. Trains from all over the Reich had reached this narrow area between the Elbe and Berlin and had been unable to proceed farther. The freight they carried was both a boon and a burden to the 12th Army. Every conceivable kind of cargo, from aircraft parts to carloads of butter, had been found on the trains. A few miles away on the eastern front, von Manteuffel's panzers were halted for lack of fuel. Wenck, on the other hand, was almost awash in gasoline. He had reported these surpluses to Berlin, but as yet no arrangements had been made to collect them. Nobody had even acknowledged his reports. Now, as he waited for Keitel, Wenck reflected with some concern that if the OKW Chief of Staff learned of his social work among the refugees, he would hardly approve. Under Keitel's code of soldierly ethics, such actions were simply inconceivable. Wenck heard a car drive up, and one of his staff said, "Now watch Keitel play the hero." In the full trappings of a field marshal, even to baton, Keitel entered the little house, followed by his adjutant and aide. The arrogance and pomp of Keitel and his group, strutting as though they had just taken Paris, seemed disgraceful to Wenck, when every road told its tale of misery and Germany lay defeated. Formally, Keitel saluted, touching his cap with his field marshal's baton. Wenck saw immediately that for all his punctilious behaviour, his visitor was anxious and excited. Keitel's adjutant produced maps and spread them out. Without preamble, Keitel leaned over, tapped Berlin, and said, "We must save the Führer." Then, as though he felt he had been too abrupt, Keitel dropped that subject and asked for a briefing on the 12th Army's situation. Wenck did not mention the refugees or the Army's part in caring for them. Instead, he spoke in general terms of the Elbe area. Even when coffee and sandwiches were served, Keitel did not relax. Wenck did little to put his visitor at ease. "The truth was," he later explained, "that we felt terribly superior. What could Keitel tell us that we did not already know? That the end had come?" Keitel suddenly stood up and began pacing the room. "Hitler," he said gravely, "has broken down completely. Worse, he has given up. Because of this situation, you must turn your troops around and drive toward Berlin, together with the 9th Army of Buss." Wenck listened quietly as Keitel described the situation. "The battle for Berlin has begun," he said. "No less than the fate of Germany and Hitler are at stake." He looked solemnly at Wenck. "It is your duty to attack and save the Führer." Irrelevantly, Wenck suddenly thought that this was probably the closest Keitel had ever been to the front lines in his life. Long ago, in his dealings with Keitel, Wenck had learned that, if you gave an argument, one of two things happened. You got 2 hours of blistering talk, or you lost your command. Now he replied automatically, "Of course, Field Marshal, we will do what you order." Keitel nodded. "You will attack Berlin from the sector Belzig-Treuenbrietzen," he said, pointing to 2 small towns about 12 miles northeast of the 12th's front lines. Wenck knew that this was impossible. Keitel was talking about a plan which was based on forces, men, tanks, and divisions, that had long since been destroyed or had simply never existed. With virtually no tanks or self-propelled guns, and with few men, Wenck could not simultaneously hold the line against the Americans at the Elbe and attack toward Berlin to save the Führer. In any case, it would be immensely difficult to attack northeast into Berlin. There were too many lakes and rivers in his path. With the limited forces at his disposal, he could only get into Berlin from the north. He suggested to Keitel that the 12th drive on Berlin north of the lakes, via Nauen and Spandau. "I think," Wenck added, "that I can mount the attack in about 2 days." Keitel stood for a moment in silence. Then he told Wenck stonily, "We can't wait 2 days." Again, Wenck did not argue. He could not waste the time. Quickly he agreed to Keitel's plan. As the field marshal left the headquarters, he turned to Wenck and said, "I wish you complete success." When Keitel's car had driven away, Wenck called together his staff. "Now," he said, "here's how we will actually do it. We will drive as close to Berlin as we can, but we will not give up our positions on the Elbe. With our flanks on the river, we keep open a channel of escape to the west. It would be nonsense to drive toward Berlin only to be encircled by the Russians. We will try for a link-up with the 9th Army, and then let's get out every soldier and civilian who can make it to the west." As for Hitler, Wenck said only that the fate of one person does not matter any more. While he was giving orders for the attack, it occurred to Wenck that in all the long night's discussion, Keitel had never once mentioned the people of Berlin. As dawn came up at Magdeburg, 3 Germans slipped across the Elbe and surrendered to the US 30th Infantry Division. One of them was 57-year-old Lieutenant General Kurt Dittmar, a Wehrmacht officer who had daily broadcast the latest communiques from the front and who was known throughout the Reich as the voice of the German High Command. With him were his 16-year-old son Eberhard and Major Werner Pluskat, the D-Day veteran whose Magdeburg guns had played an important part in preventing General Simpson's US Ninth Army from crossing the Elbe. Dittmar, who was considered the most accurate of all German military broadcasters, had a large following, not only in Germany, but among the Allied monitoring staffs. He was immediately taken to the 30th's headquarters for questioning. He surprised intelligence officers with one piece of information. Hitler, he said firmly, was in Berlin. It was enlightening news to the Allied officers. Up to now, no one had been certain of the Führer's whereabouts. Most rumours had placed him in the National Redoubt, but Dittmar could not be shaken from his story. The Führer was not only in Berlin, he told his interrogators, but he believed that Hitler will either be killed there or commit suicide. "Tell us about the National Redoubt," somebody urged. Dittmar looked puzzled. The only thing he knew about a National Redoubt, he said, was something he had read in a Swiss newspaper the previous January. He agreed that there were pockets of resistance in the north, including Norway and Denmark, and one in the south in the Italian Alps. But, he added, that is less by intention than by force of circumstance. As his interrogators pressed him about the redoubt, Dittmar shook his head. "The National Redoubt? It's a romantic dream. It's a myth." And that is all it was, a chimera. As General Omar Bradley, the 12th Army Group commander, was later to write, the redoubt existed largely in the imagination of a few fanatical Nazis. It grew into so exaggerated a scheme that I am astonished we could have believed it as innocently as we did. But while it persisted, this legend shaped our tactical thinking. Amid clouds of dust, columns of German tanks hammered through the cobbled streets of Karlshorst, on the outskirts of Berlin's eastern district of Lichtenberg. Eleanor Kruger, whose Jewish fiancé Joachim Lipschitz was hiding in the cellar of her home, watched in amazement. Where had the tanks come from? Where were they going? Instead of heading into the city, they were dashing south towards Schöneweide, as though fleeing Berlin. Were the Russians right behind? If they were, it would mean freedom at last for Joachim. But why were German troops leaving the city? Were they abandoning it? Retreating? Eleanor did not know it, but she was watching the lost and battered remnant of General Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps in the process of restoring contact with the main force. After being pushed back to the very outskirts of the city, Weidling's men had re-established communications with Busse's now encircled Ninth Army in a most roundabout way. The moment they hit the edge of the city, they had used the public telephone to call High Command headquarters in Berlin, and they had thereupon been connected by radio with the 9th. The 56th had immediately received orders to head south of the capital, cut their way through the surrounding ring of Russians, and link up with the 9th again about 15 miles from the city in the area of Königs Wusterhausen and Klein Kienitz. From there they would join the effort to cut off Koniev's forces. But first, Weidling had some unfinished business to attend to. He had now heard that officers from both Busse's and Hitler's headquarters had been sent to bring him in on charges that he had deliberately fled the battlefield, leaving his corps leaderless. Angrily, he ordered his men to push on without him while he headed into the city to confront Krebs. Some hours later, Weidling, having crossed Berlin to the Reichskanzlei, made his way through the basement to the so-called aide-de-camp bunker where Krebs and Bergdorf had their office. They greeted him coolly. "What's going on?" demanded Weidling. "Tell me why I'm supposed to be shot." His headquarters, said Weidling sharply, had been located almost on the front line from the moment the battle began. How could anyone say he had fled? Someone mentioned the Olympic village at Doberitz. The 56th had been nowhere near Doberitz, growled Weidling. To have gone there would have been the greatest stupidity. Slowly Krebs and Bergdorf thawed. Soon they were promising to clear up matters with the Führer without delay. Weidling then gave the two men a briefing on his situation. He told them that his corps was about to attack south of Berlin, and then, in passing, I casually added that before leaving, I had received a report that Russian tank spearheads had been seen near Rudau. Rudow lay just beyond the edge of the southeastern district of Neukölln. Krebs immediately saw danger. In that case, he said, the 9th's order for the 56th Corps had to be changed. Weidling's corps would have to stay in Berlin. Then both Krebs and Burgdorf hurried off to see Hitler. Shortly thereafter, Weidling was told that Hitler wanted to see him. The walk to the Führer bunker was a long one, through what Weidling later called an underground city. From Krebs's office he proceeded first along a subterranean tunnel, then through a kitchen and dining room, and finally down a staircase and into the Führer's personal quarters. Krebs and Burgdorf introduced him. Behind a table loaded with maps, Weidling wrote, sat the Führer of the Reich. When I entered, he turned his head. I saw a puffy face with feverish eyes. When he tried to stand up, I noticed to my horror that his hands and legs were constantly trembling. He succeeded with great effort in getting up. With a distorted smile, he shook hands with me and asked in a hardly audible voice whether we hadn't met before. Once before, said Weidling. The Führer had given him a decoration a year earlier. Hitler said, I do remember the name, but cannot remember the face. When Hitler sat down, Weidling noticed that even in a sitting position, his left leg kept moving, the knee swinging like a pendulum, only faster. Weidling told Hitler what the 56th's situation was. Then Hitler confirmed Krebs's instructions that the corps was to stay in Berlin. The Führer thereupon launched into his plan for the defence of Berlin. He proposed to pull in the armies of Wenck from the west, Buss from the southeast, and Group Steiner from the north, and thus somehow cut off the Russians. It was, wrote Weidling, with ever-growing astonishment that I listened to the big talk of the Führer. Only one thing was clear to Weidling. Short of a miracle, the days until final defeat were numbered. That evening, the 56th Corps, suffering heavy losses, managed to disengage from the Russians in the south, then pivot and enter Berlin. 24 hours later, to Weidling's horror, he was named commandant of the city. The order from Stalin was numbered 11074. It was addressed to both Zhukov and Koniev, and it divided up the city between them. As of this day, April 23rd, the order said, the boundary line between the 1st Belarusian Front and 1st Ukrainian Front would be Luben, thence to Teupitz, Mittenwalde, Mariendorf, Anhalter station of Berlin. Although he could not complain publicly, Koniev was crushed. Zhukov had been given the prize. The boundary line, which ran straight through Berlin, placed Koniev's forces roughly 150 yards west of the Reichstag, the place where the Soviets had always considered the city's prize plum, the spot where the Soviet flag was to be planted. Now the city began to die. In most places, water and gas services had stopped. Newspapers began to close down. The last was the Nazis' own Völkischer Beobachter, which shut up on the 26th. It was replaced by a Goebbels-inspired 4-page paper called Der Panzerbar, the Armoured Bear, described as the combat paper for the defenders of Greater Berlin, which lasted 6 days. All transportation within the city was grinding to a halt as streets became impassable, gasoline scarce, and vehicles crippled. Distribution services broke down. There were almost no deliveries of any kind. Refrigeration plants no longer functioned. On April 22nd, the city's 100-year-old telegraph office closed down for the first time in its history. The last message it received was from Tokyo. It read, "Good luck to you all." On the same day, the last plane left Tempelhof Airport, bound for Stockholm with 9 passengers aboard, and Berlin's 1,400 fire companies were ordered to the west. And now, with all the police serving in either the army or the Home Guard, the city slowly started to go out of control. People began to plunder. Freight trains stalled in the marshalling yards were broken into in broad daylight. Margarete Promeist, who made an extremely dangerous journey to the rail yards under heavy shelling, came away with a single piece of bacon. Looking back on it, she said afterward, I thought this was sheer madness. Elena Majewski and Vera Ungnad rushed all the way to the railway freight yards in Moabit. They saw people grabbing cases of canned apricots, plums, and peaches. There were also sacks of a strange kind of beans, but the girls passed these by. They did not recognize green coffee beans. They got a case of canned goods labelled apricots, and when they got home discovered it was applesauce. Both girls had always hated it. Robert Schulze fared even worse. He spent 5 hours as part of a mob trying to get at some potatoes in a large food store, but by the time his turn came, they were all gone. Storekeepers who would not give supplies away were often forced to do so. Hitler Youth. Klaus Kuster walked into a store with his aunt and asked for some supplies. When the owner insisted that he had only some cereals left, Kuster pulled a gun and demanded food. The shop owner quickly produced an assortment of foodstuffs, literally from under the counter. Kuster gathered up as much as he could carry, and he and his scandalized aunt left the store. "You are a godless youth," his aunt cried when they were outside, "using American gangster methods." Klaus replied, "Oh, shut up. It's now a matter of life and death." Elfriede Maigata heard a rumor that the giant Karstadt department store on the Hermannplatz was being looted. She hurried to the store and found it jammed with people. "Everyone was pushing and kicking to get through the doors," she later reported. "There were no queues anymore, there was no sales staff, and nobody seemed to be in charge. People were just grabbing everything in sight. If it turned out to be something useless, they simply dropped it on the floor. In the food department, there was a carpet of several inches of sticky mud on the floor, made up of condensed milk, marmalade, noodles, flour, honey, anything that had been overturned or dropped by the mob. A few supervisors seemed to be left, for now and then a man would shout, 'Get out! Get out! The store is going to be blown up!' Nobody paid any attention to him. It was too obvious a trick. Women were grabbing coats, dresses, and shoes in the clothing department. Bedding, linens, and blankets were being dragged from shelves by others. In the candy section, Elfriede saw a man grab a box of chocolates from a little boy. The child began to cry. Then he yelled, "I'm going to get another one!" And he did. But at the exit door came the denouement. 2 supervisors were stopping everyone as they tried to get out with their booty. They were letting people take food, but nothing else. Soon a great pile of merchandise began to grow near the door. People ploughed through it, pushing and shoving, trying to force their way past the supervisors. When Elfriede tried to get through with the coat she had taken, one of the store officials grabbed it away from her. "Please let me have it," she begged. "I'm cold." He shrugged, took it back off the pile and gave it to her. "Beat it," he said. And all the time, as the mob pushed and shoved and grabbed everything in sight, someone kept yelling, "Get out! Get out! The store is going to be blown up!" Nobody paid any attention to him. It was too obvious a trick. Women were grabbing coats, dresses, and shoes in the clothing department. Bedding, linens, and blankets were being dragged from shelves by others. In the candy section, Elfriede saw a man grab a box of chocolates from a little boy. The child began to cry. Then he yelled, "I'm going to get another one!" And he did. But at the exit door came the denouement. 2 supervisors were stopping everyone as they tried to get out with their loot. They were letting people take food, but nothing else. Soon a great pile of merchandise began to grow near the door. People ploughed through it, pushing and shoving, trying to force their way past the supervisors. When Elfriede tried to get through with the coat she had taken, one of the store officials grabbed it away from her. "Please let me have it," she begged. "I'm cold." He shrugged, took it back off the pile and gave it to her. "Beat it," he said. And all the time, as the mob pushed and shoved and grabbed everything in sight, someone kept yelling, "Get out! Get out! The store is going to be blown up!" One witness to the looting at Karstadt's was Pastor Lechscheit. His presence on the scene had come about in a surprising way. One of his parishioners had given birth to a stillborn baby, and the infant had been cremated. The mother, deeply distressed, wanted the urn containing the ashes properly buried, and Lechscheit had agreed to be present, even though it meant walking several miles, under constant shelling, to the cemetery in Neukölln, where the woman wanted her child buried. As they tramped along, the woman carrying the little urn in her shopping bag, they passed by Karstadts and saw the mobs looting. His parishioner stared. Suddenly she said, "Wait!" Lechscheit stood in amazement as she left my side and disappeared into the store, urn, market bag and all. Moments later she returned, triumphantly swinging a pair of sturdy boots. Turning to Lechscheit, she said, "Shall we go?" On the way back, Lechscheit was careful to keep her away from Karstadts. It was just as well. That afternoon the huge store rocked as explosives tore it apart. The SS, which reportedly had stored 29 million marks worth of supplies in the basement, had blown up the emporium to deny the Russians the treasure. A number of women and children were killed in the blast. In the face of the plunderers, many store owners simply gave up. Rather than let their shops get smashed by unruly mobs, they emptied their shelves and gave supplies away without accepting either ration stamps or money. There was another reason. Shopkeepers had heard that if the Russians found hoarded food, they burned the shop down. In Neukölln, a week before, film projectionist Günther Rosetz had tried to buy some marmalade at Tengelmann's grocery store and had been refused. Now Rosetz saw that Tengelmann's was selling tubs of marmalade, oats, sugar and flour, all at 10 marks a pound. In panic, the store was giving goods away just to move everything out of the shop. In the Kasperi wine shop on the corner of Hindenburgstrasse, Alexander Kelm could hardly believe his eyes. Bottles of wine were given away to all comers. The Hitler Youth, Klaus Kuster, making another foray through his neighbourhood, got 200 free cigarettes at one place, 2 bottles of brandy at another. The owner of the liquor shop in his area said, "Here, you might as well drink it up. Hard times are coming." Even for looters, there was virtually no meat to be had. At first, a few butchers had supplies which they doled out to special customers, but soon that too was gone. Now, all over Berlin, people started carving up horses which lay dead in the streets from the shelling. Charlotte Richter and her sister saw people armed with knives cutting up a grey-white horse that had been killed on Breitenbachplatz. The horse, Charlotte saw, had not fallen over on its side, but sort of sat on its haunches, its head still high, eyes wide open, and there were women with carving knives cleaving at its shanks. Ruby Borgman found that she enjoyed brushing her teeth with champagne. It made the toothpaste very foamy. In the luxurious cellar beneath Heinrich Schell's fashionable Gruben Sushi restaurant, Ruby and her husband Eberhard were living an almost exotic existence. Schell had kept his promise. When the shelling began, he invited the Borgmans to join him in his resplendent underground quarters. The restaurant's reserves of silver, crystal and fine china were stored there, and Schell had provided creature comforts as well. The floor was carpeted with oriental rugs. On either side of the entrance, sleeping accommodations were screened by heavy grey-green draperies. Luxurious overstuffed chairs, a sofa and small tables, each covered with beige and rust-coloured linen cloths from the restaurant, were placed about the room. There had been no water for days, but there was champagne aplenty. "We drank champagne morning, noon and night," Ruby remembered. "It flowed like water, the water we didn't have." Food was the real problem. The Borgmans' good friend, Pierre van Hoven, who sometimes shared the cellar's comforts with them, was occasionally able to produce some bread and even a little meat on her visits. Mostly, however, the occupants lived on tuna fish and potatoes. Ruby wondered just how many ways there were to fix these staples. The restaurant's temperamental French chef, Mopti, had yet to repeat himself, but he could not go on forever. Still, now that there seemed no hope that the Americans would come, the little group had decided to live it up. At any hour they might be dead. Papa Senger was gone. Through 4 years of bombing and through the shelling of the last few days, the 78-year-old World War I veteran had refused to be intimidated. In fact, it had taken all of Erna Senger's powers of persuasion to prevent her husband Conrad from going out for his customary meeting with his World War I comrades in arms. She had put Papa to work digging a shallow hole in the garden to hide her preserves. Conrad also thought it might be a good idea to hide his old army sword along with the jams and jellies, so the Russians would find no weapons in the house. But once the work was done, Papa had gone out into the streets despite the pleadings of the entire family. They had found his shrapnel-riddled body in the bushes outside the burning wreckage of Pastor Martin Niemöller's house, only a short way from home. While shells blanketed the district, the family brought Papa home in a wheelbarrow. As she walked alongside the cart, Erna remembered that during their last conversation she had a slight difference of opinion with Conrad as to which biblical quotation was more appropriate for the times. Papa maintained that one can only live by the 90th Psalm, especially the 4th verse. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Erna had disagreed. Personally, she told him, I think that psalm is much too pessimistic. I prefer the 46th. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. There was not a coffin to be found, and a trip to the cemetery was too dangerous to attempt in any case. Still, they could not keep the body in the warm house. They left it on the porch. Erna found 2 small pieces of wood and nailed them together for a cross. Gently she placed the crucifix between her husband's hands. As she looked down at Papa, she wished she could tell him that he had been right, for the 90th Psalm continued, We are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. Father Bernhard Happisch looked down at the notes for his sermon. The chapel of Haus Dahlem was softly lit by candles, but outside the sky to the east of Wilmersdorf was almost blood-red, and the shelling which had awakened the sisters at 3 that morning was still going on nearly 12 hours later. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered, and a tremendous concussion shook the building. Father Happisch heard loud shouts from the street, and then the heavy thudding sound of the Czech anti-aircraft gun just across the road from the maternity home and orphanage. The nuns sitting before him did not stir. As he gazed out at them, he saw that, in keeping with an order from Mother Superior Cunegondes, the women had removed the heavy silver crosses they normally wore. Instead, small, inconspicuous metal crucifixes, so-called death crosses, were attached to their habits. The silver ones had been hidden, along with all rings and watches. Father Happisch had made some preparations of his own. In the Dahlem villa where the priest lived, a large box had been packed. In it, Father Happisch had placed some medical instruments, the contents of the medicine chests, plus drugs, bandages, and white sheets contributed by neighbours. Before becoming a priest, Father Happisch had received a medical degree, and now he was working again at both vocations. Each day now he cared for casualties of the shellings, attended to accident victims, and treated hysteria and shock cases. When the American soldiers reached the west end of the street, the shells had already been falling for hours, but the GIs found little left for them to fight. On the main road, in the meantime, a few rifles crackled intermittently. The Americans had moved forward, across the bridge over the Spree, and through the wreckage of the buildings that were now flattened against one another. By this time, the defenders had also been driven from their last positions in the north and east. A very young German officer who had been ordered to defend the northwestern approaches to the Reichstag had survived all the shelling only to be shot and killed when the Americans appeared. As the Americans crossed the Spree and advanced through the rubble, they could see the last defenders, their comrades who had already been shot or taken prisoner, gathering on the roof of the Reichstag. They were waiting for the end. There were no shots left in their rifles. The Americans' artillery kept up a steady barrage. A few machine gun bursts were heard from the centre of the city, but the Americans' fire was increasing and had become more effective. The defenders were now out of their trenches. German commanders had instructed their men to retreat from their positions and await orders to make their final stand. Those men who had not yet been hit began to flee. As the Americans closed in, a few snipers took potshots from ruined buildings. The defenders gathered on the roof of the Reichstag, where the few remaining German officers made their last stand. Eventually, even they gave up, and the last defenders were overrun by the Americans. When the last fighting was over, a huge crowd of German prisoners was gathered in the debris-filled streets. Soldiers and civilians alike found themselves in the hands of the victorious Americans. For them, there was no more hope of escape. The German war was finally over. The city, finally liberated, lay in ruins. Why afraid? Everything all right now. Go to sleep. For one group of Berliners, the arrival of the Soviet troops produced no terror at all. The Jews had long ago come to terms with fear. Leo Sternfeld, the former Tempelhof businessman forced to work as a garbage collector for the Gestapo, had sweated out every mile of the Russian advance. A half-Jew, he had lived all through the war in anguished suspense, never knowing when he and his family would be sent to a concentration camp. For most of the war, his name had made Sternfeld and his family unwelcome in air raid shelters. But when the shelling began, Leo noticed a remarkable change in his neighbours. "The residents of the house," he recalled, "almost dragged us into the shelter." Sternfeld was overjoyed when he saw the first troops in the Tempelhof district. They were orderly and peaceful, and to Leo they were liberators. The Russian battalion commander asked if they might have a room in Leo's house to hold a celebration. "You can have anything I've got," Leo told him. He had already lost half his house when the nearby post office had blown up some days before, but there were 3 rooms left. "You can have the one with the ceiling," Leo assured the Russian. In return, he, his family, and some friends were invited to the party. The Russians arrived, bringing baskets of food and drink. "It seemed to me at one time," Leo said, "as if the entire Russian army joined the party." The Russians drank enormous quantities of vodka. Then, to the accompaniment of an accordion, the battalion commander, an opera star in private life, began to sing. Leo sat enthralled. For the first time in years he felt free. Joachim Lipschitz came out of hiding in the Kruger's cellar in Karlshorst to meet the Red Army troopers. Speaking in the slow, halting Russian he had taught himself in his months underground, he tried to explain who he was and to express his gratitude for liberation. To his amazement, the Russians howled with laughter. Slapping him boisterously on the back, they said that they, too, were happy, but they added, choking again with laughter, that he spoke terrible Russian. Joachim didn't mind. For him and for Eleanor Kruger, the long wait was over. They would be the first couple married when the battle ended. As soon as they received their marriage certificate, it would represent, as Eleanor was to put it, our own personal victory over the Nazis. We had won, and nothing could hurt us any more. Everywhere, as areas were overrun, the Jews came out of hiding. Some, however, were still so fearful that they remained in their secret places long after the danger from the Nazis was past. 20-year-old Hans Rosenthal was to stay in his 6-by-5-foot cubicle in Lichtenberg until May, a total of 28 months in hiding. In some areas, Jews were freed and then faced with the prospect of having to go underground again when the Russians were thrown back in temporary but violent and widely scattered counterattacks. The Veltlingers in Pankow had one of the strangest experiences of all. They were liberated early. The Russian officer who entered their hiding place in the Moorings apartment would always be remembered by Siegmund as the personification of Michael the Archangel. When he saw them, the officer called out in poor German, "Ruski, no barbarian, we good to you." At one time he had been a student in Berlin. Then suddenly there was a tense moment. The officer and his men searched the entire apartment house and found 6 revolvers. To the assembled occupants, the Russian announced that he had found them hidden with discarded uniforms. Everyone was ordered out of the house and lined up against a wall. Siegmund stepped forward and said, "I'm a Jew." The young officer smiled, shook his head, made a motion as though cutting his throat, and said, "No more Jews alive." Over and over, Siegmund repeated that he was a Jew. He looked at the others lined up against the wall. A few weeks earlier, many of these people would have turned him in had they known his whereabouts. Yet Siegmund now said in a clear, loud voice, "These are good people. All of them have sheltered us in this house. I ask you not to harm them. These weapons were thrown away by the Volkssturm." His statement saved the lives of all the tenants. Germans and Russians began hugging each other. "We were drunk," Siegmund said, "with happiness and joy." The Soviet officer immediately brought food and drink for the Weltlingers and stood anxiously watching them, urging them to eat. Both Weltlingers nearly became ill from the food because they were not used to anything so rich. Immediately, Siegmund said, people became very kind to us. We were given an empty flat, food and clothing, and for the first time we were able to stand in the fresh air and walk a street. But then the Russians were thrown out of the area by an SS attack, and the same residents Weltlinger had saved the day before suddenly became hostile again. It was, said Weltlinger, unbelievable. The next day the Russians retook the area, and once more they were liberated, but by a different Soviet unit, and this time the Russians would not believe that Weltlinger was a Jew. All the men in his building were loaded onto a truck and driven away for questioning. As Siegmund said goodbye to his wife, he wondered if all this deprivation, all this hiding, was now going to have a senseless end. They were taken to the northeastern suburbs, and one by one were questioned in a cellar. Weltlinger was brought into the room and placed beneath a bright light. Sitting in the darkness were some officers at a long table. Once again, Weltlinger insisted that he was a Jew who had been in hiding for more than 2 years. Then a woman's voice came out of the darkness. "Prove to me you are a Jew." "How?" She asked him to recite the Hebrew profession of faith. In the silence of the room, Siegmund looked at the shadowy faces sitting in the darkness before him. Then, covering his head with his right hand, his voice filled with emotion, he said one of the most ancient of all prayers, the Shema Yisroel. In Hebrew he slowly intoned, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Then the woman spoke again. "Go," she said. "You are a Jew and a good man." She too was Jewish, she said. The next day Siegmund was reunited with his wife. "No words," he said, "can describe how we felt when we met again." Hand in hand they walked in the sunshine, free and as happy as children. If Mother Superior Kunigundes felt any fear, it did not show on her round, peaceful face. The battle was raging all about House Dahlem. The building shook every time the tanks fired, and even in the sandbagged cellar the concussion could be felt. But Mother Superior Kunigundes no longer paid any attention to the rattle of the machine guns and the scream of the shells. She was praying in the little dining room now turned into a chapel when the firing lifted. For a moment the noise of battle seemed to fade. Still, Mother Superior Kunigundes remained on her knees. One of the sisters came into the chapel and whispered to the Mother Superior, "The Russians, they are here." Mother Superior Kunigundes calmly blessed herself, genuflected, and quickly followed the sister out of the chapel. The Soviet troops had first approached the home from the rear, through the gardens. They had appeared at the kitchen windows, grinning and pointing their guns at the nuns and lay sisters. Now 10 troopers led by a young lieutenant waited on the Mother Superior. Lena, the cook, a Ukrainian, was hurriedly sent for to act as interpreter. The officer noted the Mother Superior, looked very smart, and his behaviour was excellent. He asked about House Dahlem. Mother Superior Kunigundes explained that it was a maternity home, hospital, and orphanage. Lena added that there were only nuns and babies there. The lieutenant seemed to understand. "Are there any soldiers or weapons here?" he asked. Mother Superior Kunigundes said, "No, of course not. There is nothing like that in this building.